Hello and welcome to our next video lesson. Okay, so today I've got something we're going to make use of in this week's lab. I thought what would be interesting is to build up a bunch of different types of inputs so that you could have a sort of a flexible type of application later. And of course, we're going to be using object-oriented inheritance in order to accomplish this. So let's get started. So you can see what I've got up here right now is I've got a small HTML file. So far, the only thing I've got is I've got this two divs. I've got a div here called my input and a div called, well, you know what, I'm going to call this my output as well. And inside the input, all they've put is an I. Inside the output, all they've put is an O, which doesn't really look like very much of input or output, but eventually we'll modify what's in here. Okay, and I've also got this file here called inputtypes.js. Well, this is where we're going to be putting all of our code, and I'll just give you a quick little view. This is what the current page looks like. It doesn't look like very much interesting. It just has an input and output. Okay, so let's get started. So the first thing I'm going to do is, in order to make the input as flexible as possible, what I've decided to do this time is I'm going to create this thing called a flexible input. Okay, so of course, what is a flexible input, and what am I talking about? Well, you know that there's lots of different types of inputs on web pages. For example, we've got the classic input that we go when we type things, and well, we've already been through in a couple of times in classes where we might have a button for actually recording the input, but I think I also got you guys to use the enter key once for deciding when the input was actually done. And of course, there's lots of other types of inputs as well. If you think about web pages that have calendar inputs, quite often when you click on a calendar, you get a big calendar view that pops up that you select your input. So these are the types of flexible inputs I'm talking about. Okay, so we're going to begin with this very simple thing called a flexible input, and really we're going to begin with a very generic type of input because this is going to be sort of the main class, and then we're going to start extending this class to have different types of inputs. So I think it'll probably make more sense once I get this one built and I get at least the beginning of the next class built as well. Okay, so well, let's get started. So the first thing off is I'm going to have a constructor, of course, but now the question is what am I going to put in here? Well, I've decided that there's two things that my flexible input is going to keep track of. Number one is the actual value itself. So this is the actual thing that's going to be entered. The second thing I'm going to hang on to is something called ELT, which is an abbreviation for the element. So the element is the actual place where this input is going to appear. For example, over in my example here, I'm probably talking about the thing called my input. Okay, so it's going to be called ELT, and all that I'm going to do to begin with is I'm going to say this ELT is equal to the parameter called ELT. Okay, and that's it. I'm not going to do too much else in this file yet, or sorry, inside this class yet, but I certainly may come back to it and add more things. All right, now if we do have something called a value, I think it would be very useful to have a function called getValue, which we would kind of assume is probably going to return this value. All right, and let's see, what else do we want? There could be some other things that we will want as well. But again, I'll come back and we'll add these things after we get started. Okay. All right. So first of all, you're going to realize that there's absolutely no HTML input in here whatsoever. And that's the idea, is I don't want this to actually be an input because eventually I'm going to start replacing this with all kinds of strange looking things. Okay, but here's what we're going to do. I'm going to come down here and I'm going to create a new type called HTML input with button. Yeah, it's a pretty long name, but I think it does describe what we're looking for. Okay, and what we're going to do is this is going to start by extending this thing called a flexible input. Okay, and what are we going to do in here? Well, the types of things that I want to do in here is I want to be able to take this thing called my input and actually generate an input, like an HTML input tag, and some kind of an enter button. Okay, and I think the way how to get started with this is, well, let's just go off and get started with a constructor. Okay, and again, I'm going to pass in this thing called ELT to get started. And I'm going to do something a little bit different. Okay, first of all, because this is an extension of this class up here, the first thing you have to do is you have to call super so that you get your parent's constructor to work. All right, but here's where things are going to start getting a little bit different. Okay, now, what am I talking about? I'm talking about an input with a button. Okay, so in other words, what I really want to have here is something called an input type. Okay, so what does an input look like? Well, there's a few different ways. I know normally we've been creating HTML documents by going into the HTML elements by going into the HTML document and adding things. But like what we did with the SVG stuff, I'm going to use this other thing called create element. Okay, I don't need the NS this time. I don't need the namespace because we're creating just regular HTML things. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create an input, and well, there's my input created. I'm also going to create something called the button, which of course is the button that you end up clicking on. Okay, so let's take a look at this document, create element. Okay, and we'll create a button as well. Okay, so here we go. Now we've got ourselves an input area and a button. And well, what would we like to do with this? Well, to begin with, we're going to start by taking this elt and we're going to call append child. And we're going to put in this thing called an input, and we're going to say this elt append child, and we'll put in the button. All right, now down here in our main area, we better actually start making use of some of these things. Okay, so let's go and create, what should we call this? We'll call this the test, and we'll say this is a new HTML input with a button. And where are we going to put it? Well, let's put it into document get element by ID, and we'll look for the thing called my input. Okay, now let's go take a look and see whether or not this makes any sense so far if I go and load this, because what we're doing is we're creating this new test thing, this new HTML input with button, and I am going to give my input as the element, and inside the element I'm going to create an input and a button, and I'm going to append these elements inside that particular div. All right, let's take a look and see what we've got. Perfect. You can see we've got an input here. You can see that we do have this thing, we do have a button. It doesn't look like much of a button right now because it doesn't have any words. And there unfortunately is also this letter I. Well, if you remember, the entire thing started here with the letter I. Now, if you don't want that letter I, you could first of all get rid of it from here, but instead I'm going to do something a little bit different. Inside my flexible input, after I've hung on to the value, I'm going to say this elt dot inner HTML is empty. Okay, and that will end up getting rid of everything that's inside here before we start adding these new child elements. Okay, now a couple of things about this. First of all, having a button that looks like this with absolutely no text on it is not very nice. It actually doesn't really look like a button. So we're going to start by simply putting some actual text here. So I think probably the best thing to do is why don't we take the thing called button, and of course, well, remember that's just an HTML element. That's the same thing you would have gotten by saying document.getElement by ID. And there's a bunch of things you can do. You can go and you can set something called inner HTML or inner text. I'm going to set the inner text here, and I'm going to say, let's say record value. All right, now let's go back and take a look at this. Now you can see it's replaced the actual text inside. Okay, so any difference between inner HTML, which we have used before, and inner text? Very, very subtle difference. Inner HTML means that you're actually passing HTML tags in here, and this is going to cause the browser to go through and actually parse the HTML tags. But here, there's nothing else. There's no HTML tags. There's only text. So that's the only thing I'm going to pass in. So I'm going to use this thing called inner text. Now, in order to hang on to these inside other functions later, rather than using this as a local variable like I've defined it here, I would really like to turn this into some class variables. So let's have a class variable called input and a variable called button, and we'll talk about this input, we'll talk about this button, and we'll talk about this button inner HTML, and we'll talk about appending this input, we'll talk about appending pressing this button. Okay, so that should make absolutely no difference. Okay, exactly the same thing, but at least this way, now I've got access to this button property, and I don't have to go back and start asking for get element by ID in my later functions. Okay, so there's the first thing. Now, how does this whole thing work? Well, what I want to be able to do is I want to be able to come over here to type in something like hello, click on record value, and well, that should actually record the value. Now, what does it mean to record the value? Well, okay, we'll get to this in a couple of minutes, but obviously nothing is happening right now when I click on this button because, of course, we're missing a click event. So here's the first thing I'm going to do is before we do anything else, I want to go to this input and I would like to add a new event listener. Okay, and you've seen me do this a number of times. And what we're going to do is whenever somebody clicks, we're going to call the following function. Okay, so let's just do a console.log first and make sure something is going on. So we'll say the button was clicked. Okay, come over here, we type in some stuff, you click on this button and it says the button was clicked. Oh, and what did I end up doing? I think I clicked on the wrong thing. Click. Okay, should be all right. All right, come over here. Oh, you see what I've done? I've attached it to the on click on the input rather than on the button. Okay, well that was silly. All right, let's take it from here and paste it down here. Okay, here we go. Good, that's working, and now when I click on the button, now I'm getting the actual message that the button was clicked. Okay, well, I don't want to just see a message to the console that the button was clicked. I would actually like to call another function. So let's call the function, what would be a good name to call this one? Just give me a second while I use the same names that I've got in my sample here. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to call this record input because at this point that's when the actual event took place. And all that I'm going to do is I'll go down here and I'll make this new thing called record input. And here's what we're going to do. Remember that I am an HTML input with button, and I am a type of flexible input. Because I'm a flexible input, I therefore have something called value. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say this value is equal to, okay, well, all I need to do is to pick up the inputs value. So remember, I have an input as well, which is the actual box, and it has a value. Okay, all right, so that's actually going to record the actual value inside here. Okay, well, let's go give this a try. So far, it won't look very interesting yet, but at least we're a little bit closer, and we'll find out whether or not the clicking on the button actually works. So save it over here, load it, and let's type hello, and we'll click on record value. Now, of course, we can't see anything, but if we come down to the console and I type out the name test, we can take a look, and you see that the value now of this variable called test is actually being set up, and it does contain the string that I just put in there. And we can try it again, another, and click record value, and we type and take a look and see what's inside test, and here it is. It's now being updated with the word another. Okay, so far so good. Now, we're going to make things a little bit more interesting yet. How would the rest of the program know that somebody has now input something? Now, normally what we end up doing in event-driven programming is we record event handlers. So this is absolutely no different. What I would like to have is the ability to call another function in part of the application. I'm trying to avoid doing things directly inside this class because I want to be able to reuse this same class in other projects later. But what I would like to have is I'd like to have a function down here called update output. And what I would like to do is I'd like to be able to change the value. Okay, so console log, and we'll say change the output now. And what I want to do when this happens is I want to come into this output, which starts off as the letter O. Okay, so we'll call it empty so far. And I want to be able to replace that with whatever the person just typed. Okay, so a couple steps in order to get there. Okay, the first step is how this thing right here, this is the one that gets called when the person clicks on the button. Now, I suppose what I could do is I could come down here and I could call it update output directly like this. But I'm not so interested in doing this type of thing because this means that if I wanted to reuse my HTML input with button, it's only going to work if I have a function called update output. And guess what? It's not going to work if I have two of these HTML inputs with buttons. Okay, so I need something a little bit different. And here's the approach we're going to pick. Okay, up here in my flexible input, I have a value and I have the element. I am going to have another new attribute added called changed, let's call it value changed handler. Okay, and what this is going to be, this is going to be a function. So let's call it a VCH, and I'm going to say that this value changed handler is equal to VCH. And what is a VCH? Well, it's going to be a function. Okay, it's going to be a function, and what's going to happen is when I record the input, I'm going to call this value changed handler, and I'm going to give this value as a parameter. Okay, so here's what we're going to have. We're going to have the value. Okay, and let's put it down here. We'll say the value. And here's how we're going to make use of it. We're going to go to, when we create this new HTML input with button, I am going to include a value change handler. And then I'm going to call my parents value change handler. So you see what happens is when I call this constructor, I pass in update output as the name of the function. So this HTML input with button, it says, please create an input area right here on my input, and if something happens, please, or whenever somebody enters a value, please call the function update output. Okay, and what I'm doing is I'm making this as flexible as possible, because if I had two test buttons, I could send them to two different functions. All right, so let's find out whether or not this much is working. So what I want to see is when I click on something, I want to be able to see in the console, change the output now, and I want to see the value that was just entered. Let's go over and take a look. Okay, and we'll type the word record, and yes, that is being changed, and we'll change it to the number 345, and yes, this is so far working. Okay, well, the only thing left to do now is let me modify this right here, and we'll say document get element by ID. We'll ask for my output, and we'll set the inner text is equal to the value. Okay, so that's the only thing we're going to do, but I'm going to do one extra thing. Okay, I'm going to console.log, and I'm going to console.log type of value, because I'm going to get you to do a small exercise in a second. Okay, so let's check and see whether or not this is working. Okay, so test input, and when I click on record value, you can see the output is now changed to the phrase test input, and for some reason it is now complained about the type of the value. Okay, try it again. Hello. Okay, so it changed the output to hello, and you can see the type is a string. Okay, and if we type 456, it changes here, but of course the type is a string. Okay, so now here's your first exercise. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop this. I'm going to zip up exactly what I've done here, and I'm going to put this into D2L. Then your task is to download a copy of this file, and I want you to do a small extension. Oh, you know what? I've got one extra thing I'm going to do before I upload this, so you have one extra piece. Okay, over here. When you type in a number like 567 and record the value, yes, we can see it actually happens, but if you remember in a few cases way back, this is maybe late January, I was getting you to clear the input each time. Let's add this as an optional feature for my inputs, okay, because I think this will end up helping things out a little bit. Okay, so what I want to do is I'm going to go back over to this flexible input, and I'm going to add a new property called auto clear. All right, and the way how this is going to work is if this happens to be equal to true, then it's going to end up being cleared as soon as the value has been let's see, what could we do? How about when somebody reads the value? So right here, this thing called get value. Ooh, okay, so I'm going to start making some more changes to this. So I'd like to move this a little bit closer before I zip this up and get you to do the exercise. Okay, here's what I want to do is rather than handing in the actual value itself, I would like to hand in just the word this. Okay, so what would that end up doing? Well, this would end up giving me the input. Okay, this is now the input. So let me have a value called val, and we're going to ask for the input. And I would like to be able to get the value, and then I'd like to be able to set this to val. Okay, so that probably won't make that much of a difference. Empty help. Okay, good. So this is working, but of course now what I've got is I've got an object. All right, so not much difference, except I'm trying to avoid getting the actual value directly. I want to use this function called getValue. Because maybe I want to do some processing to it. Okay, there's a bit of a hint because think about what type val is right now. Okay, so here, in fact, we'll actually print this thing out. Console log type of val. Okay, even if we type in a number like 1, 2, 3, 4, okay, I am getting the value, and of course it says string. Yes, that's a bit of a hint about what you're about to do in a few seconds. Okay, so that's the first thing. Second thing is up here, as soon as you get the value, here's what I'd like to do. If this auto clear, okay, first of all, let me have a return value. Red is this value. If auto clears this, I'm going to say value is equal to undefined. In other words, I'm going to completely empty the entire thing out, and I am going to return RET. Now, that would actually clear out the value, but would it clear out the input? And no, it wouldn't clear out the input because, well, this is called flexible input, and it doesn't know what the input is. Inputs are things that only appear down here. Okay, so here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to call the function this.clear input area, and I'm going to have a function here called clear input area, and it is going to do absolutely nothing. But down here in my extended class, clear input area is actually going to do something, and we're going to say this input value is equal to, well, empty. That's exactly how you'd normally clear. So remember, this input is actually an HTML input. Okay, so let's go off and give this a try. So what could we do with this? Well, let's say test auto clear, and we'll say this is equal to false right now and see whether or not this is working. So this says that if we put something in, it won't clear it out. So there's a bunch of junk, okay, and yes, it is working so far. And what about if I change it over to the word true and I do some test value? Okay, this time you see when I click the record value, this input is automatically cleared. Okay, so now I will zip this, and this becomes the first part, or the first exercise that I want you to follow. Okay, so here we go. Don't worry, there's a copy of this document also on D2L, so please download a copy of this. So this is what I've got so far. It says today's lesson. Watch the YouTube video. Well, I don't have a link for it yet, but before this document gets uploaded, I'll put it in. And what I want you to do now is to create something called an HTML number input with button class. And I want you to only allow numeric inputs. And I want the get value to return a number. Okay, so what does this mean? Okay, so you got a couple of things. First of all, over here, I shouldn't be able to type any letters. Hint, there's an input type called number, and if you change it over to that format, you'll only be able to type digits in here. Second thing is, even if I type in the number 1, 2, 3, 4 and record the value, right now it says it's of type string, and I want that, of course, to say number. Okay, so that's the end of this video. So please download the zip file of what I've given you right now, and please try adding a new HTML number input with button. Okay, and I'll be back whenever you're finished. Take as much time as you need, maybe about 15-20 minutes. It's not a really big stretch, so please give this a shot and then come back and I will walk you through my solution, which I think is going to be different than yours. Okay, so check the next video out.